Hi, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Claude Dantonez, director of this wonderful museum, for inviting me. I'd like to thank as well Yves Winken, Dominique, Veronique, everyone at Labexcap. What a generous convergence of minds and ideas. So thank you so much. I'm really humbled by such company of esteemed group of academics and historians and curators. The conclusions I will put forth are rather aesthetic and intuitive. Perhaps in this way they are related to those of the great collectors of curiosities themselves. It's also really a great honor for me to follow this incredible last speaker, David Wilson, whose work I've admired for over 20 years, which is when I first stepped foot into the museum as a young student in Los Angeles, and had forever changed my perceptions on reality and on exhibition making or museology. Um, Hic sint draconis is a Latin phrase meaning "here be dragons" that purportedly exists on the edge of certain medieval maps and globes, and it serves to occupy the liminal area behind the known world. When I consider the netherworld obscured from light and reason, I feel a sense of nostalgia for a time when wonder was at its zenith, when one could only speculate what beasts and tribes and lands existed beyond the horizon. Cabinets of curiosities represent something more than just an accumulation of wonder. Their contents existed at the periphery of the known world. These cabinets of wonder represented a much more fluid and intuitive way of not only collecting but of organizing information. The cabinet collectors themselves were in the habit of recognizing patterns and congruencies across lines of time and space, when in modern sciences and humanities, such subjects would be kept separate. It is the boxes that we put things in that keep changing. Cabinets also served as a membrane between this world and that, between real and fantasy, between the material and the metaphysical, between the civilized and the savage. I approach collecting of images in a similar fashion. How can I find an image that can keep us together in this phantasmagoria of images that are constantly in front of us, that solicit, enlist, and perhaps also exhaust our own imaginations? I began a year-long project collecting images that I sourced from expired Soviet encyclopedias to the World Wide Web, cut from old accounting books and ephemera brought to life with ink, paint, scissors, and collage. I created a new work every day for 365 days in the hope of exposing our contemporary reality with all of its social anxieties and displaced identity. For many years, I worked as an illustrator for the New York Times, among other such clients. Having become fluent in the language of images, my objective was to synthesize the signs and symbols of our times into a cohesive and precise visual metaphor. Here we have my laboratory of sorts, the Department of Signs and Symbols. The name is indebted to the Museum of Jurassic Technology, of course, with its own insignia. And though this daily project and intention was to do something that I was less used to, without premeditation, these works were raw and stream of consciousness and open to interpretation. It had occurred to me that this intuitive process, as I had described, for organizing was more familiar to the lost art of cabinet collecting. Cabinet of curiosities, which originally served to contain the rampant curiosities of their collectors, eventually became appreciated by a larger audience by acting as a time capsule. These collections offered a zeitgeist of an entire culture. Similarly, I discovered that through my own subjective process of pattern recognition and association, I was able to tell not only my personal story of that year, but as I was combining universal archetypes, inadvertently, this visual taxonomy could come to speak to a greater collective experience. This diurnal exercise liberated me somehow from thinking inside the box, and my unconscious came to the surface in a way I had never before. In this day and age, the image has been cheapened to an unprecedented degree. As a sort of archaeologist, I went on a hunt for those scarce and meaningful images, which I treated as specimens, each one stamped with a number and then sandwiched between two panes of glass. In a way, I like to think of myself as a kind of historical revisionist. Not the same thing as a Holocaust denier, but simply a revisionist of history. What is history but a memory? So I began to ask myself, if one can modify the vestiges of that memory, the photographic record or the imaginary record of a society, can history itself be changed? Somehow, strangely, these sorts of interventions became my specialty. And it's amazing what a little colored pencil can do to change a narrative. For example, an advertisement that once served as a beauty product, as a beauty ad, now describes perhaps a more truthful reflection of the predatory relationship we have with beauty. Here's another few from the series. This is number 365, and the exhibition in its completion, you can see that the works themselves were treated as sort of specimens and were floated between panes of glass. This is at the Invisible Dog Art Center in Brooklyn. And although the collection has since been dispersed, it does exist within the context of my first published book, which you're all welcome to have a closer look at afterwards. As cabinets of curiosities represented what was at the periphery of the known world, dancing on the edge of the familiar and the peculiar, they shared a romance with Freud's definition of the uncanny. Oftentimes, these collections reflected our own perversions, a lust for the strange, for the hermaphroditic, mutations to the otherwise normal. Congenial gave way to congenital. Sometimes specimens corroborated folklore, as in the case of the narwhal tooth, proving the existence of the unicorn. Other times, species were simply lost in translation. No cabinet was complete without a bird of paradise. Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist and founder of modern taxonomy, first named the bird Paradisia apoda, or legless bird of paradise, because early tradeskins to reach Europe were prepared without wings or feet by natives, leading to the misconception that these birds, visitors from paradise, kept aloft by their plumes, never having touched the earth until their death. As such was the demand in mermaid remains that oftentimes specimens were deliberately fabricated. The fabled Fiji mermaid, originally bought for the equivalent of $6,000, was simply a trout stitched to the torso of a monkey. This is my attempt at a Fiji mermaid. Something as ordinary as a flea market ceramic, with a slight aberration, becomes something otherworldly. I'm just going to grab a little bit of water. That's all right. In conclusion, clearly, what really captivated the imagination is that moment in which the exhibit departed into the realm of the unknown, which oftentimes, unsurprisingly, shared space with the fantastical. When Claude Dantonès asked me to conceive of a body of work for the Musée de la Chasse, I became enthralled with the idea of not only inventing new specimens of life, but also with the exploration of the taboo subject of creating pseudo-historical artifacts. Retelling a fictive safari expedition, I manipulated 18th and 19th century engravings to explore the art of hunting as a metaphor for man's quest of self. The objective was to successfully manipulate the image by harnessing the given style and technique of each antique engraving or watercolor in order to confuse the viewer as to what is authentic and what is intervention. These 20 counterfeit historical works were then integrated into the permanent collection of the museum. Greatly inspired by David Wilson and his Museum of Jurassic Technology, I wanted to integrate these works in such a way that the artworks would blend seamlessly into the permanent collection, confusing fact and fiction. Thanks to my friend philosopher Emmanuel Cochia, who helped with the translations, each piece came complete with a Latin taxonomical title engraved on a metal plaque. Traditional cabinets of curiosities are almost always a hybrid between natural science and art. Kunst Wunderkammer is the known term. The wonders of God alongside the wonders of man. In our contemporary museums, this convergence is shockingly absent. Here we have Servus Armatus. It occurred to me how this image could have been interpreted or published as an editorial in the New York Times discussing gun violence. The context of the works, I think, is incredibly relevant, and in a sense, these ancient memories are reorganized to reflect a complex relationship to gun. Oh, sorry, I said that already. Uh, the Musée de la Chasse is an exception among historical museums in that it is willing to venture far from convention, along with Claude Dantonez and his team, to confuse what is museological objectification. In effect, obscuring the ontological role of a museum, the exhibition, and the historical fact altogether is at the heart of this approach, citing the writings of philosopher Vincent Normand and his project Garden and Bestiary. So I asked myself, when and where has this biological urge to hunt and kill been displaced to in our current society? This instinct must manifest itself somehow. Certainly, collecting activates the same part of the brain as hunting does. Collecting images, objects in a Wunderkammer, shopping, serial dating, psychoanalysis, the hunt for self, all could be interpreted as a metaphor for hunting. Having these modest works contextualized in the bounty of historical facts, artifacts that this museum offers, is essential to its success, leading the viewer on a sort of safari. Here we have Hippotigris spiraliformis. And this is Servus iterativus. Published just this week, coincidentally and consequentially, many of these works are in an encyclopedic tome titled Wunderkammer. Perhaps by the end of the day, we may have a copy in the back. However, unfortunately, there was a mishap with the post. It further dipped down the sort of rabbit hole of confusing history and art. This idea of manipulating images for the purpose of changing history has a long and fine tradition, such as in the former USSR. Here, you can watch as the Commissar vanishes. For me, this sort of retouching of history is happening constantly with every Instagram filter applied. There are countless examples of how our collective conscious is molded by images. Most images, other than those emanating from the art world, are largely interpreted as factual, as true records of a specific place and time. In fact, the underlying hand-painted French engraving from the 17th century was the equivalent of a modern-day photograph. However, by embedding an alternative narrative into the setting of a historical image, my hope is to reveal greater inherent truth about our condition, rather than to obscure it, as was with the case of the former retouched photograph. What is fascinating for me is to consider that the contents of the natural world has remained rather constant. The world hasn't changed really in several thousand years. However, what is constantly changing are the boxes, the categories that we as a civilization put things into. Emmanuel Okochia argues in his book, The Life of Plants, as man identifies himself as an animal, mankind has a zoocentric view on the world. Therefore, because man is indeed an animal, the humanities should be as much part of biology and zoology and the natural sciences to be considered as spiritual sciences. I'm not an academic nor a philosopher, but an artist, and this blurring of lines is music to my ears, and I'm certain was music to the ears of countless collectors of curiosities. This image sort of serves as an illustration of this dichotomy between the civilized and the savage, which I think is often visible in cabinets of curiosity, and has become really the focus of my work of the last year. The civilized is represented by the rational and the linear, and the savage as the unrepressed, unbridled, unconscious. Therefore, I would argue that cabinets of curiosities served as a valve between the material and the metaphysical, as a conduit for the collective unconscious. Here's a quote from anthropologist Edward Dudley A given culture is only as strong as its power to convince its least dedicated member that its fictions are its truths. This provocation that in order to be an active participant in our civilization, we must willingly embrace and champion subjective falsehoods as empirical truths is a thrilling concept for an artist who engages in manipulating the visual byproducts of this very culture, to say the least. In this body of work, collectively titled Totem and Taboo, after Freud's 1913 eponymous essay, I explore the relationship between the psychic lives of so-called savages and the civilized. The exhibition took place in a private New York gallery that appropriately offered a domestic setting, and contemporary artworks were counterposed with objects from a private primitive art collection, quote unquote. At times, my paintings are direct interventions on found images, and other times, photographic images are sourced and interpreted as oil paintings on linen, in this case stitched with various found objects, found materials. Whatever the conjured image, my works are always somehow tied to the photographic record, which not only serves as a lifeline to our collective memory bank, but allows for the opportunity to examine and subvert the official record. In this way, I stand by and hope that a moment of recognition can occur in which the viewer has an experience of déjà vu, certainly in the setting of this domestic space, which functions as a surrogate for one's own childhood home. I was quietly waiting and hoping that some moment of recognition may occur. In any case, this particular painting was inspired by a photograph of a Jesuit nun combing the hair of an indigenous child. I was riveted by the simultaneous expression of nurture and oppression. With this painted Oneric Western figure, essentially copulating with her unbridled tribal counterpart, I pose the question of who is in fact savage and who is civilized. Dispersed throughout the exhibition, these plates were a series taken from the book Sculpture of Primitive Man, published in 1957 by Werner Münsterberger. Münsterberger was a preeminent psychoanalyst whose work spanned most of the 20th century. He happened to have James Dean, Laurence Olivier, and Marlon Brando as some of his notable clients. He was also an established tribal art expert and collector. He was passionate about collecting and basically invented the term ethnopsychiatry. Coincidentally, he was born the year that Freud published Totem and Taboo. For me, he epitomized this marriage between animism and psychoanalysis. Earlier, we were speaking of archetypes with the 365 project. Well, I was delighted to discover that both shamans and shrinks drew from the same palette of archetypes. In fact, we as human beings, our collective unconscious shares a finite set of archetypes congruent over space and time, and this is why we can find artifacts from remote cultures so compelling. A theme common in my work, as you may have seen, is this morphing of individual figures and bodies together. Just as the individual versus the collective, this binary of the self and the other is the paramount paradigm of human psychology. Does this look familiar? We're just describing Sigmund Freud's study. Western man has been forever obsessed with the archetype of the noble savage, the unbridled sexual, physical, spiritual self that in the West is very often repressed. Freud even argued in his essay Civilizations and Its Discontents that in order to be an active participant in civilization, one had to be repressed. In fact, well into the 20th century, the more civilized a man, the more it was expected that he may own a menagerie of African masks or other ritualistic trinkets. All of these adornments, going back to the first cabinet collections, were most certainly talismans, there to conjure this connection that the Western man had been stripped from by mere participation in civilization. I speculated that Freud and his cohorts were clearly fascinated by the representation of alternate states of consciousness represented in so-called primitive art. In Totem and Taboo, works are exhibited face à face, essentially questioning who is the observer and who is the observed. These objects, fetishized as tribal art or primitive art have you, were largely ritual tools to appease the spiritual forces at play in the external world. They serve to restore the order to the natural world, the weather, human fertility, agriculture, and virtually every aspect of human existence. If not tended to, these ritual interventions would take revenge on the unsuspecting human. Essentially, the shaman in traditional society was the interlocutor between the physical and the spiritual world. Since the Enlightenment, Europeans have turned inward towards subjective experience and away from tradition. My assumption is that the role of the psychoanalyst and the treatment of mental aberration through analysis is a perfect metaphor for the shaman and ritual activity in traditional culture. However, today, the forces that need to be tamed are our own thoughts. Although I was the only contemporary artist on display, I curated the exhibition as a group show, the rest of the artists, of course, being anonymous. The furniture, the objects, even the art above the toilets, everything was curated to maximum effect. Primarily a painter, a creator of images, I'm very much interested in the creation of experiences as well. In addition to the exhibition, we had curated a bi-monthly salon series inviting leading thinkers in the related fields to use the exhibition as a convergence of ideas. We had Jameson Webster, a leading psychoanalyst, Chiara Bottici, Italian philosopher, Lawrence Weschler, who is the author of this wonderful book on David Wilson and the Museum of Jurassic Technology. I recommend it to everybody. And we also had invited Alan Steele, who was the collector and connoisseur of many of these objects in the exhibition. And perhaps my favorite piece is this painting that turns a corner and becomes a support for an amulet from New Guinea from the early 19th century. Through my own experience of curating, collecting, observing, connecting, and counterfeiting, I've come to understand that the contents of the cabinets of curiosities across Europe should be understood as stand-ins for the collective unconscious. As the world became smaller with each new discovery, this temple of wonder was clearly a repository for the dreams and nightmares of colonial Europe. I believe that the exploration that was emblematic of the great cabinet collectors was not of a terrestrial kind, but more of a metaphysical voyage. And the contents of their cabinets were not a selection of incongruous objects, but the substance of our collective dreams. This, from my very last exhibition titled Noble Savage, a Soviet photograph that I had interpreted as Cortez's march on Montezuma when his fellow conquistadors were mistaken as mythological centaurs. This peculiar pursuit of reorganizing history has led to my current project, developing a series of contemporary artifacts to be reintroduced into the priceless collection of rare books and prints at the University of Amsterdam. Not bound by science, religion, or dogma, a nonlinear approach to collecting and understanding our existence corresponds as much to the curation of cabinets of curiosity as it does to the artistic practice. Artists really never invent anything new. However, what we do is reveal new associations among existing objects. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks a lot for this incredible images, and especially the Moctezuma thing is really something fascinating, and it reminds me that at the Museum of Beaux-Arts in Montreal, the collection of so-called indigenous pieces, and they called contemporary artists to do something like that about colonial and post-colonial look at this collection. So it's a great opportunity for we are to deal with problem of some rarities and stuff from cabinets. Sometimes it's just that the journal called Cabinet published a lot of good things, and especially very good illustration, according to me. C'est un journal qui s'appelle Cabinet et qui a beaucoup investi dans le genre, si j'ose dire, de ces illustrations et de ces thèmes. S'il y a des questions sur... Peut-être que M. Dantonès, d'ailleurs, en parlera-t-il Non, est-ce que tout le monde attend le café? Bon, on peut... vous pouvez parler avec l'artiste, si j'ose dire.
Yeah,
pendant
please.
la pause café, it's more
I insist if anyone has a question or would like to have a look at any of these books, please come see me afterwards. Thank you for your attention. Thank you again for the invitation. Very honored to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oui.